Israel's recent escalations in Gaza's southern city of Rafah have intensified the world's pressure on Israel, with several countries, including long-standing allies, announcing tougher stances. Over 1 million displaced Gazans in Rafah keep getting messages from the Israeli army to move to other areas, despite global warnings about an impending humanitarian catastrophe, where more than 7 months of conflict has claimed over 35,000 Palestinian lives and devastated infrastructure, leaving people hungry, sick, poor, and homeless. Last week, the US paused the shipment of bombs to Israel due to concerns about civilian casualties. But this week, the White House informed Congress of its intention to send a $1 billion arms package to Israel. Even the paused shipments, experts say, won't be enough to deter Israel from bombing Palestinians given the stockpile that it already has. The EU has indicated that the operations in Rafah will significantly strain its relations with Israel, but how that will manifest, if at all, is yet to be seen. In the region, Egypt and Turkey have declared their intentions to join South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Qatar, which is heavily involved in mediation efforts, has announced that ceasefire negotiations have come to a stalemate, saying that Israel wants to talk about hostages first, then end the war without a clear way out of the conflict. Meanwhile, Arab foreign ministers are convening in Bahrain for the 33rd Annual Arab League Summit to formulate an action plan to end the Gaza conflict. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. This week, I'm looking at the international and regional reactions to the intensification of military operations in Rafah, and what diplomatic moves from Arab countries could put an end to this conflict. I'll start first with the National's own Hadia Al-Alawi, the National's foreign correspondent who is covering the events of the Arab League Summit in Manama this week. Hadia, what are the main objectives of the Arab League Summit in Bahrain regarding the Gaza conflict, and what outcomes can be expected from that?
I think reaching a unanimous agreement on ways to stop the war in Gaza, I would say, is the main objective, halting the violence and working towards achieving a two-state solution for the Palestinians. There is an unofficial draft of the final communique, which was seen by the National, which included clauses that would call for the deployment of international protection and peacekeeping forces affiliated with the UN in the occupied Palestinian territory until the two-state solution is implemented. And the second clause that we also saw relates to an international peace conference to be held in Manama in the coming months to rebuild an international momentum to revive the two-state solution. So I think what we're seeing in this summit is trying to have all the Arab states behind, the final communique. We spoke to Hussam Zaki, the Assistant Secretary General of the Arab League, who told us that there was a complete consensus during the foreign ministers' meeting, which was held on Tuesday, regarding the war in Gaza. He said that the Bahrain Declaration is going to be a continuation of what was adopted in Riyadh. He also commented and he said that the war has evolved, so they are adopting a political position that is adequate with the current circumstances in Gaza. But also when we asked if severing relations with Israel was an option in this summit, he said that's not something that they discussed. So we're still expecting the final text, but also there's going to be notably a tougher stance against Israel. One of the sources has also told us. You remember probably there was a Riyadh emergency summit in November, but it failed to win a majority consensus from the Arab states. So this one it builds on that, but the difference is that this one, there's going to be a general consensus, we've been told, from all Arab states attending. And also the other thing to mention is that the conference comes at a backdrop of the UNGA's vote supporting Palestinians' bid for a full UN membership. So everything is leading us to believe that this summit is going to hold a significant weight.
So it seems from what you just said that this conference is going to be pretty significant and impactful, hopefully for the future of Palestine, but also from the Arab position towards Palestine, which has always been in support. But from your conversations with diplomats and attendees, are you seeing a stronger change in public perception towards Israel and pro-Palestine, perhaps, that's different from the past?
Yes, there's a shift in tone. And what I've really noticed is that there's unity that we haven't seen probably before, amongst leaders, even amongst the media who were asking questions, that there needs to be more done to stop the war on Gaza. The mass killings of over 35,000 civilians so far. There's anger, frustration, and disappointment in the international community's inability to stop the atrocities taking place in the tiny strip. So what I've seen this time and what we've noticed on the ground is that there is actually a much stronger and a bigger need to take more action against Israel to stop it. And even like the diplomats that we spoke to have expressed their frustration about the international community's inability to stop them. Even the UN are unable to stop the atrocities, we were told. So yes, there is a change, a significant, and it also relates to the size of what is happening on the ground in Gaza. It's been 7 months, relentless bombing, relentless killing of civilians. No one is being spared, not children, not women, not the elderly. So the atrocities that we're seeing there are actually reflected in what we're seeing in the summit here. What you hear people saying behind closed doors, what kind of questions the media are asking. They're angry. Everyone is angry. Arabs on the streets are angry. So they want the leaders to do more. They want the representation in the world, to the international community, to stand up and have a united stance against what's happening in Gaza. So yes, it is significantly more powerful. I think it also relates to the recent events in Rafah and the attack on 1.5 million Palestinians who were forced to flee in the first place and forced to go to Rafah. And now they have nowhere to go and they're being attacked and they're being killed. So the general feeling that I get here is anxiety, it's fear, but also at the same time hope that if the Arab states do reach a political consensus, that it might actually build enough pressure on Israel to stop the war.
For a more international view, I'm joined by retired Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz, who is a former U.S. security coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority and currently a senior fellow at RAND Corporation. Mark, in your view, is the U.S. really adding more pressure on Israel? And is that pressure a significant amount or just a symbolic one for posturing?
From the U.S. perspective, I wouldn't say that the longstanding alliance between Israel and the United States is iffy at this point. Certainly, the administration has been working for months to encourage Israel not to make some of the same mistakes that the U.S. made when it was conducting large-scale combat operations in urban centers. And so, as you recall, we sent over military advisors. Certainly, both the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State have done multiple engagements, both in person and by phone, to encourage the reduction of destruction of infrastructure, and with that, the reduction of innocent Palestinian civilians. I think after the approval from the U.S. Congress to provide the additional military assistance to Israel came about, there was still, back channel dialogue about, okay, what's your approach going to be towards the Rafah offensive, the Rafah government more broadly, and then certainly Rafah City. And clearly the administration is not satisfied with what the feedback has been given by both Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Minister of Defense writ large, and therefore they have withheld the delivery of some of the munitions, specifically the 2,000-pound bombs that are part of this large package that was approved by Congress. So certainly, what you're seeing is that that's playing out in the media, it's playing out politically here in the United States, and you've certainly seen a significant number of protests across college campuses, and that has, grown not just, outside of the United States. But all that said, I think fundamentally what the issue is the amount of innocent, civilians that have been, caught up in this conflict, the lack of acknowledgement early on by the Israeli government of how important it is to provide safe haven and basic human necessities to the Palestinian population while they prosecute the offensive. And so it came to a boiling point, certainly right after the congressional approval. And I think the stance will continue despite, what you hear in the news, because our Defense Department and certainly our administration wants to see that the Israelis are taking all the precautions that are rational to reduce the continued destruction of infrastructure that ultimately will have to be rebuilt, as well as, more importantly, the loss of innocent lives.
It is clear that the US is adding more pressure on Israel, but this pressure seems to not be enough to deter Israel from what it plans on doing. There are still people, innocent people, being killed every single day. And to ask Israel to be more wary of innocent lives 7 months into a war is a little bit too late. Not that Israel is being more careful. We're still hearing about children. We're seeing them every single day.
You haven't characterized that correctly, because this dialogue has been going on since the outset of the offensive, shortly after October 7th. If you remember, we sent a couple of military professionals, the United States Central Command, our Secretary of Defense have all been talking to Israel about this. And so certainly the amount of pressure has been building over the course of the conflict, but the position on behalf of the administration, the international community, I think has been very consistent. Now, the challenge you have, right, is that, Israel's a sovereign country. They clearly see Hamas, and rightfully so, as a national security threat. And the way in which they have determined to carry out their offensive is, while it may be in conflict with the United States and our values and how we would like to see the war prosecuted, ultimately there's only so many levers that you have against another nation state. And we are trying to do as much as we can, we being the United States, to influence, the Israeli government and certainly the Israeli defense establishment. But ultimately, it's going to be their decision. And I don't think that the suspension of some of these larger munitions is going to be, it's a tactical move in terms of, trying to create more influence. I would assess that the pressure behind the scenes that's not in the public view is even stronger than what a lot of folks, I think, have an appreciation for. But ultimately, Israel has the forces and the capabilities it needs to continue its offensive. And, the suspension of some of these large munitions is not going to, impact their ability to ultimately complete the Rafah offensive and the ongoing, or the follow-on, security operations that are going to need to take place well beyond the Rafah offensive.
Let's talk about the suspension of large munitions for a moment, because the US announced that it is suspending these munitions, but then, the White House informed Congress of its intention to send $1 billion in arms to Israel. And I would assume that Israel already has a stockpile. So it's not like these bombs that are not being sent to Israel are actually having an immediate impact on the ground. What do you make of that?
Well, that's correct. And, there's those munitions that are part of the large aid package. It's a multi-billion-dollar package, actually. I don't think that the suspension of certain munitions is going to impact the ability in a decisive way for Israel to carry out, what its objectives are in Rafah. Remember also that some of those munitions are being used to go after Lebanese Hezbollah and, other targets in Syria potentially. So that against Iranian proxy. So, I think that certainly it has an impact in terms of the broader defense and the supply chain for Israel. But in terms of the near term, I think Israel will be able to carry out its tactical and operational objectives inside of the Gaza Strip, without those munitions.
So the US decision to suspend these arms is just a symbolic move?
Well, I think it's more than symbolic. It's, again, it's a clear message to Israel. Israel would like to have, everything that was agreed upon in the, with the congressional approval and all the dialogue that's been going on between the U.S. Defense Department and the Minister of Defense, the experts in Israel in terms of, okay, here's the munitions that we'd like to see, because they don't produce a lot of these munitions internal to Israel, right? So the supply chain is essential. And as you pointed out earlier, to rebuild stockpiles that they've already expended, because they don't know, they being Israel, don't know how much longer the external threats are going to continue. But I think they're being prudent and asking for munitions that will allow them to rebuild their national stockpiles, not only to continue with the current offensive, but also to be in a position to where they can continue to defend themselves against external threats, and Iran being the principal external threat.
Okay, let's talk a little bit wider on the kind of international outlook. What implications could Egypt and Turkey's decision to join the genocide case at the International Court of Justice have for Israel, in your view?
Well, Turkey's been very critical of the ongoing offensive even before what's been playing out lately in the recent weeks. So you've seen Hania and Erdogan shaking hands, and they certainly have a relationship, which is in my view very concerning. More nations that join the condemnation against Israel's actions certainly has an impact, and obviously with Egypt specifically being bordering Gaza and going to serve in the future, as it has in the past, as a principal logistics avenue going into the Gaza Strip, as well as the importance of the cooperative security relationships that Israel and Egypt have had for decades now. I think all that has an impact, but I think the long-term implications are still yet to be seen.
So Qatar said that the ceasefire talks have reached a stalemate between Hamas and Israel, and it sort of put that kind of onus on Israel for wanting to talk about the hostages first before ending the war, instead of vice versa, just ceasefire first, then hostages. At the end of the day, it seems that nobody really knows how this war is going to end. What do you think is the way that this war ends properly and permanently? Hostages first, then ceasefire, or ceasefire first, then hostages?
Well, Israel, and I certainly respect their position, that there is no rational reason why Israel should agree to a permanent ceasefire with a terrorist organization of Hamas. And so I think that what has been out in the news a little bit, but I think is growing more and more true as the days go on, is that I don't think Hamas really has a handle on the current status of the majority of the hostages that remain inside of the Gaza Strip. They're being held by other organizations, other terrorist organizations like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and potentially some other militias. And so there's, I think part of it is that Hamas can't really deliver on, kind of the basis of negotiation. Hey, let's get another 40 hostages so we can exchange them for, another 120 or more Palestinian prisoners who have been convicted in Israeli courts. So that, I think, which one's going to come first? I mean, it is part of a comprehensive dialogue in terms of let's have a pause in combat operations to allow the exchange of hostages for prisoners. And Hamas is, I think, on the ropes in terms of, I would say at the strategic level, they're on the ropes in terms of what their future holds. Certainly inside of the Gaza Strip, their political leadership is enjoying the safe haven and sanctuary of Qatar and other, states where they have relations. But I think that time is limited also. And I believe that, once the political leadership outlasts its usefulness to strategic dialogue to enable the release of hostages, that you'll see a much different approach being taken by, in my assessment, certainly the United States and definitely Israel, and ideally, more of our Arab partners in the region.
But it does seem like it would be pertinent to put a ceasefire first for the humanitarian situation's sake, which is becoming increasingly worse, especially with the closure of the Rafah and Karam Abu Salim borders. But when it comes to the kind of political and military gains on the ground, perhaps this is a naive question, but do you envision that perhaps Yahya al-Sinwar and Mohammed al-Deif are Netanyahu's bin Laden? Is this what you think it will take for Netanyahu to declare that he has won the war and at the same time save face among the Israeli public?
Well, I can't speak to the domestic challenges that the Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing, but certainly in terms of I would put Hania in that group as well. So the three, terrorists that you just outlined, I think they are Israel's, near-term bin Laden, right? So, and the elimination of those leaders and all of the terrorist infrastructure that supports them, I think is vital to the end state that Israel has declared that it wants to achieve. It's going to be a long road. There's no security capability that can fill the security vacuum inside of the Gaza Strip once the IDF pull out. And I believe that there's, ongoing and increasingly more serious dialogue, both with the United States and Israel and other international partners in terms of, okay, how do we address this? Because Israel does not want to have an enduring occupation of the Gaza Strip. It's not in their, security interest. It's certainly not in their political interest, I think. And internationally, the U.S. certainly does not support it as is the case with many other nations. So, there's a couple of major challenges there. And you're right that the pause in military operations to enable more humanitarian assistance, the fact that the Erez crossing up north now is being used much more frequently, and you're seeing a significant increase in throughput of humanitarian assistance. And then, of course, the Mediterranean pier that's being put out there off the coast of Gaza is also going to help. So all those things acting concurrently to try to relieve the humanitarian crisis that exists inside of the Gaza Strip is vitally important. But, I think also the Prime Minister cannot and will not take his eye off the principal objective, which is to eliminate Hamas's military capability and deny its ability to ever govern inside of Gaza. Now, what comes after, both from a security governance standpoint, that is continuing to be discussed and worked on, but I think it's still going to take several more weeks, if not months, to come forward with I would say, agreed upon approach, a concept, and then ultimately some detailed planning to see, what will come after.
That's it for today. Check out thenationalnews.com for more coverage on the conflict, and please remember to subscribe to get our weekly analysis of the war in Gaza on Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Arthur Edison and Dua Farid, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher.